Welcome to the Rediscovery channel. This is the channel where every week I, Ivor Kovac, and my good friend Stilgar take turns bringing a topic from history that the other person may or may not know about. And so today it's my turn, and I'm going to ask Stilgar, have you heard of Hyperborea?
Hyperborea. Uh, no, doesn't Borea mean northern something?
Correct. Yes. So,
So hyper northern? Yes.
so
People in Scandinavia, are they Hyperboreans somehow? I don't know.
well, that's a good and legitimate question, actually. And I'm going to talk more about that actually during this presentation. So Hyperborea is actually a Greek word, and I was first exposed to this idea in middle school when I had to read Edith Hamilton's mythology, and I didn't really pay much attention to it. The idea is that there used to be a civilization in the North Pole or close to it in the Arctic. And the
This
Greek
is
name,
tied to this Weltijslehre that we talked about that the Nazis were a fan of.
yeah, the Nazis, they may have actually looked for Hyperborea. I didn't actually include them in my
Okay.
study. I heard they were looking for something up there.
An island, right? Where
Yes.
apparently civilization started. Yeah.
Well, Hyperborea wasn't, if it existed, was an Indo-European civilization, and there are legends in different Indo-European cultures about people that lived there. So for this for what I'm doing now, I'm going to look at the Greek myths, Persian, and Indian mythology, where these legends occur. And I might touch on Germanic mythology as well, somewhat. So basically, this was a long time in coming. And I was reading a book called The Arctic Home in the Vedas, and it took me forever to read, even though it wasn't a very big book, because it's highly esoteric and it's not written for, people with my level of knowledge. It's written for, other scholars that have spent their whole life studying this stuff. Um, but anyways, I want to start with the Greek concept because that's what I heard first. So the name means, if you literally translate it, beyond the north wind is what it means, Hyperborea. So if these people and their realm existed, then Hyperborea was not the name that they gave themselves, but the name that was given to them by outsiders. So Boreas is the Greek god of the north wind. And the idea is that these people live beyond the north wind. Um, and here's some of the characteristics according to Greek legend. So according to their legends, it produced excessively abundant harvests. With about half the effort that it took for the Greeks to grow the same kind of crops. And the people that lived there, the Hyperboreans, lived to be about 1,000 years old. They worshipped Apollo, who's the Greek god of light, not to be confused with Helios, who's the Greek sun god. Um, and it was a place of forests and meadows. And it was either light continuously all year, or other legend says that the sun only rose and set once a year. And there was no disease or any debilitating old age. So I have something here. Okay. So this is from my Edith Hamilton's mythology book, which I've had since middle school. It says, in the remotest north, so far away, it was at the back of the north wind, was a blissful land where the Hyperboreans lived. Only a few strangers, great heroes, ever visited it. Not by ship, nor yet on foot, might one find the road to the marvelous meeting place of the Hyperboreans. But the Muses lived not far from them, such were their ways, for everywhere the dance of maidens swayed, and the clear call of the lyre sounded, and the ringing notes of flutes, With golden laurel they bound their hair, and they feasted merrily in that holy race. Sickness and deathly old age had no part. So they still die, but it's not like a horrible death. Like, they still get old and die, but it takes a lot longer, and there's less suffering along the way. And then I have
They just die in their sleep or something.
Yeah, kind of like Tolkien's Numenoreans, the original concept that he had for them. Although he connected his Numenoreans with Atlantis, which is a different legend from Hyperborea. So there's a Greek legendary hero named Perseus, and he actually visited this place on his journeys to kill the Medusa. He was the one who killed one of the Gorgons. And I'll just read a little bit of that as well. He was bound, although he did not know it, to the blessed country of the Hyperboreans, at the back of the north wind, of which it is said, neither by ship nor yet by land shall one find the wondrous road to the gathering place of the Hyperboreans. But Perseus had Hermes with him, so that the road lay open to him, and he reached that host of happy people who are always banqueting and holding joyful revelry. They showed him great kindness. They welcomed him to their feast, and the maidens, dancing to the sound of flute and lyre, paused to get for him the gifts he sought. So it's interesting, like the Greeks talk about these people, but they're not actually Greeks. It's a different culture, and Herodotus, he also talked about them, the great historian. And Herodotus, he was skeptical of whether or not the Hyperboreans even existed, but he made mention of them, and he said that there's a place called Delos, which is in Greece, and according to those people, they received offerings from some civilization that lived further to the north. And they believed that they were receiving the offerings from the Hyperboreans. And what happened is, in the ancient past, the Hyperboreans sent 2 women, and I think it was 5 men, to carry these offerings to them, to sacrifice at the shrine of Apollo. And they never came back. Whether they were killed or waylaid or just chose of their own, never to come back. The Hyperboreans never found out, so after that, they stopped sending people, and they just sent the deliveries by way of courier. And supposedly, this was still going on when Herodotus was there, and he just wrote down what those people said themselves. And he didn't say whether or not it was true. But according to the people of Delos, the deliveries passed through, the Scythians. And Herodotus said something about the Scythians because he actually asked them if they had ever seen the Hyperboreans. So, and I'll just read directly from Herodotus here. He says, about a Hyperborean people, the Scythians report nothing, nor do any of those who dwell in this region, unless it be the Isidonians. But in my opinion, neither do these report anything, for if they did, the Scythians would also report it, as they do about the one-eyed people. Hesiod, however, has spoken of the Hyperboreans, and so also has Homer in the poem Epigonoi. At least if Homer was really the composer of that epic. So he was, he was skeptical about everything, but he would report it.
Yeah,
so
that's why he's the father of history, right? Called
that's
sometimes. Yeah.
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 So
New thing.
yeah,
Yeah,
so
that's cool. The Hyperborean. So they would send people there and they wouldn't return. Is that to
they
the
sent
Hyperboreans?
no,
Or
the Hyperboreans, according to the people of Delos, the Hyperboreans sent 2 women and a group of men. I think it was 5 men. Let me just check the number here because it's in the same. He makes mention of it. Okay, so At first, they say the Hyperboreans sent two maidens bearing the sacred offerings, whose names, say the Delians, were Hyperoche and Laodike. And with them, for their protection, the Hyperboreans sent 5 men of their nation to attend them, those, namely, who are now called Peripheries, and have great honors paid to them in Delos. Since, however, the Hyperboreans found that those who were sent away did not return back, they were troubled to think that it would always befall them to send out and not to receive back. And so they bore the offerings to the borders of their land, bound up in wheat straw, and laid a charge upon their neighbors, bidding them send these forward from themselves to another nation. These things, they say, come to Delos, being thus sent forward. And I know of my own knowledge that a thing is done which has resemblance to these offerings, namely that the women of Thrace and Paeonia, when they sacrifice to Artemis, the queen, do not make their offerings without wheat straw. So,
Okay.
so whatever this is, by the time that Herodotus is recording, it was already like ancient history.
Yeah.
So the next thing I want to do is, and I think the reason why I never bothered with this legend in middle school is because, today the Arctic region is mostly beneath the water, except for a few islands like that belong to Russia mainly. But I want to talk about the conditions at the North Pole because before I get to the next set of legends, it's relevant. So if you're at the North Pole, and not just the North Pole, but the surrounding area, the sun rises, and when I say rises in this context, I mean like you can see like the circle of the sun sticking above the horizon. So the sun rises, it becomes visible in March and sets in October. So the sun actually stays in the sky for 6 months straight. But before the sun comes up, and after it goes down, it's actually there's light before you see the sun, and
Yeah.
after it goes down, you still have light for a while.
Well,
Twilight
it's
and
like
dawn.
right before sunrise and sunset, and right after sunset, it's
Yeah,
not completely dark. Like it's still reflected through the atmosphere, the light.
yeah. It's bent through the atmosphere so that you can still see the light for a while, and
Yeah.
um, so that's it in the Arctic. Whether it actually this would also be true of the South Pole as well. That process takes a lot longer. So I found out that there's 3 types of twilight, and there's the civil twilight, nautical, and astronomical. So the civil twilight is, let's see, between when you physically see the sun and when it is 6 degrees below the horizon. And the civil twilight is where it's still bright enough that you can clearly make out objects that are on the ground. You can still see with relative ease. And in the North Pole, the civil twilight lasts for 2 weeks. But then there's the astronomical twilight, which is the farthest end of it. So that's where the sun is 12 to 18 degrees below the horizon, and there's just a bit of light in the sky. And in the North Pole, the astronomical twilight sunset ends on twilight and sunset ends on November 13 and begins again on January 28. So there's only 11 weeks of true, complete darkness, full night where there's no light of the sun at all.
Yeah. Hmm.
I guess you already know this stuff, but our
Well,
audience,
I didn't know the exact numbers, but yeah, never thought
yeah.
about it, to be honest.
Well, I never thought about it either until I read this book, which I'm getting to.
Yeah. I did know that
So
the twilight was last. He had this periods of twilight, but I never really thought about how that influenced everything. But yeah, only
yeah,
11 weeks. Well, only 11 weeks is that's also relevant, right?
yeah, it is
Only
actually.
11 weeks of full darkness. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
It's almost three.
it's
Almost
actually
3 months.
very important. Um, there's a reason why for it, but yeah. So, anyways, the light of the rising sun. So, how do you tell time if it takes, days and weeks for the sun to rise and set, and only rises set in once in the year? So, even though that's the case, like as the sun is rising, and even after it's up, it's gonna appear to complete one circle overhead. And so you still are aware of a 24-hour period because of how long it takes the sun to complete one circle. Also, when the sun is coming up, the light of the sun, before you see it, is going to complete one circle around you in the 24-hour period. And so will the stars. And when I was a kid, one thing I used to do is read these astronomy books, and they had like pictures with a time-lapse camera. So if you're in the North Pole and you put a time-lapse camera at the sky and you just let it go for a day, you're going to see all the stars swirling around overhead, and they'll form circles except for the North Star, which is stationary. So that brings me to this ancient Hindu legend called Mount Meru. Have you heard of Mount Meru before?
Never, no.
It's actually very important in Hindu cosmology, especially during the ancient world. It's a mythical mountain which forms the center, because these people, like most ancient cultures, had a geocentric worldview. They thought everything goes around the earth. So Mount Meru is a great mountain which goes up, I believe, like thousands of miles into the sky, according to their legends. And unlike, most mountains, it spreads out and gets wider and bigger towards the top. And according to the mythology, it's the center of the universe, and everything circles around it, including the sun, right? So when I first heard about Mount Meru, I'm like, how does it make any sense? But and by the way, if anybody's wondering, I forgot to say this. I meant to say this at the beginning of my presentation. Like as I mentioned in the video about the Amazons, in the ancient past, there was a much greater Indo-European realm where you had Indo-Europeans stretching unbroken all the way from Ireland to India and China. So in what is today Western China, you had this group of people called the Tocharians. And then you had all the Scythians wandering about in the area that today we call Russia. And then you had the Persians, and then you had the Vedic Aryans. And even today, there's still some cultures, some groups, which live in the East, outside of Europe, but are almost completely unmixed Indo-European populations, like the Kalash people of Afghanistan, and the Kalash people of Pakistan, which I'll put pictures of them in the slideshow, the Nuristanis of Afghanistan, and the Pamiri, which actually live in southwest China. And all three of these groups, like you and me, could pass for them. If we just dress like them, we could blend in with their populations. So they're the fragments of this once much greater group. So at any rate, the Mount Meru, they thought that all the heavenly objects circled around it, and that the gods also lived up there near the top. And some people today have been trying to say that, oh, Mount Meru is in the Himalayas. It's a really tall mountain. But there's nothing in the Himalayas that would meet the requirements of Mount Meru, because Mount Meru, everything's got a circle around. So what is Mount Meru? Well, if you're up at the North Pole and you're near the Earth's rotational axis, it looks like everything is circling around overhead around this specific point. But how do you make that into a mountain? Well, if you look at a diagram of the Earth's magnetosphere, you'll see something in the center that it kind of looks like a funnel going out, which I'll include images of this in the slideshow. So it looks like Mount Meru was, the shape of it comes from the shape of the Earth's magnetosphere as it would appear at the North Pole, if you could if you physically draw it and represent it. Today, of course, the magnetic north doesn't really line up with the Earth's rotational axis, but historically the magnetic north has shifted around this way and that way. So it could be that at some point in the past they were one and the same, if you get what I'm saying. So there's some evidence that, from the ancient Vedic culture, they either were aware of, they either lived close to this area where you could see all the objects swirling around overhead around a particular point, or they were aware of it by studying it. So now what I want to do is come to the bulk of my evidence, which comes from this book called Arctic Home in the Vedas. And it was written by a guy named Balgangadhar Tilak. It was written in 1903. And Balgangadhar, he was an Indian Sanskrit scholar. He used to study all the Vedas. And he also used to hang out with other scholars, like German scholars, and even some English scholars and other Indian scholars who were studying this stuff. And he got started with this theory of an Arctic home for the ancient Indo-Aryans when he was in jail, actually. He got locked up for saying something against the English. And while he was there, one of his friends, Max Mueller, German scholar, gave him a copy of the Rig Veda to study. And what he found is that people that were translating the Rig Veda into English, and I would suppose German and maybe Hindi, like all the other modern languages, were not, in some places, they were not doing direct translations because there was a mismatch between the concept, how it was originally written in Sanskrit, and how they were making it to be. Because there was some stuff that didn't make sense in terms of how they were translating it. So he wrote this book to make sense out of it, basically. And the Vedas, before we get into it, there are 4 of them. It's the oldest Indian literature, maybe like some of the oldest literature in the world for sure. So there's 4 Vedas. You have the Rig Veda, the Sama Veda, the Yajur Veda, and the Atharva Veda. And of those, the Rig Veda is oldest. And all of these are older than the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the mythological and the Puranic literature. These are all older. And each of the Vedas is subdivided down into 4 sections. You have I don't know if I can say these, I'm going to try. The Aranyakas, which are like rituals and practices. The Brahmanas, which are commentaries on the rituals. The Samhitas, which are prayers and blessings and chants. And then the Upanishads, which are like philosophical narratives and dialogues. So one thing that it took me a long time to kind of understand this book is because I didn't really know much of anything at all about the Vedas, except that they're very old. And what Bal Gangadhar does is he makes all sorts of references to Vedas and where the passages could be found. And then in some cases, he offers English translations by other scholars. And in some places, he does his own translation. So it's kind of like I'm learning about this stuff at the same time that I'm reading his arguments. So it's kind of tough. But I did finish. So let's see. So the first thing, I'm not going to go through all the evidence in the book, but I do want to talk about the ones that I felt were the strongest out of those that I was able to kind of understand what he was talking about. And have you heard of, I'm going to ask if you heard of, probably not, Ushas before. Does it sound familiar?
No.
So Ushas is the first time I heard of her too. And she is the Vedic goddess of dawn. The Roman equivalent of Ushas would be Aurora, which is where we get our term Aurora Borealis from. And the Greek equivalent is Eos. And actually, when I first started searching for Ushas, I wanted to find a picture of her to put in the slideshow. I only found one or two images, and they may not even have necessarily been Ushas, but just things that were labeled as such. So she's not very important in Hindu worship or mythology today, but she was very, very important in the Rig Veda to the ancient Vedic Aryans. So the first bit of evidence I have here, and bearing in mind that the dawn takes very long up there in the North Pole. They had this chant called the Ashvina Shastra, and that was recited to Ushas, Agni, and the Ashvins. I still I don't remember what the Ashvins were, but Agni is the god of fire, and he's still mentioned in the Ramayana, where like Sita, she jumped into the fire. So this Ashvina Shastra is over 1,000 verses long, but in order to be done correctly, it has to be done between the appearance of the first light and when the disk of the sun appears over the horizon. So this is done during the dawn. And according to the HYPERBOREA Brahmana, they give some instructions for the priest, like what the priest is supposed to do if he loses his voice during this long chant. It says, he ought to eat ghee before he commences repeating, just as in this world a cart or carriage goes well if smeared with oil. Thus his repeating proceeds well if he be smeared with ghee. And that's, of course, by eating it. And then there's instructions on what to do if the priest finishes before the sun appears. He is supposed to sacrifice an animal and recite some other chants. And then if the sun still hasn't come up by the time that he's done, he can recite all 10 mandalas of the Rig Veda. So, I mean, okay, a 1,000 verses long. Like, I haven't read this chant or heard it, but all these instructions, it sounds like the sun would be up, if we're talking about where India is today, or even where I live or where you live. I think that's enough time for the sun to appear, right? So basically the idea is that the only place this would work is in a place where it takes, a day or more for the sun to come up. That's the only way that you can complete this long process. So then there's also other stuff like Usha's is asked not to delay and to hurry up and complete her task so that she doesn't get scorched by the sun. And it's described like this, the horses that pull her chariot are described as slow. And it also says in the Rig Veda that in the former days, she dawned continually or perpetually. And she's described as with the adjective Shashvatama, which means the most lasting. It's a Sanskrit word. And again, like that's I don't know Sanskrit, but that's how he translated it in the book. So dawn is described as taking days to rise. And there's a passage, verily many were the days which were aforetime at the uprising of the sun, and about which, O dawn, thou wast seen moving on as toward a lover, and not like one who forsakes. And that's where he translated this passage himself from the original Sanskrit text, and that's found in the Rig Veda. So how is it that there's all this mention about days of dawn? How can it be when dawn is supposed to just happen once a day, right? So the only way you would have days of dawn is if you live in a place where it takes days and days to dawn, and you know that a day has passed because that light is going to complete one circle around you. So that's the argument here. And then it's also written, and this is the Taittiriya Samhita, says that dawns are 30 sisters, and they go around in groups. And also, the dawns have 30 steps. So what he's thinking is that it took 30 days of dawn before the sun would appear. And then there's also references to the long night. in the Vedas. So references to long darkness and continuous nights are there, and they would pray to different gods to carry them through the night, including Aditi, Mitra, Varuna, and the Ashvins. And then they said that it's written that Agni shines through the continuous nights, and that he stayed too long in the darkness. So I'm not going to try to read this. I'm going to try to read this phrase here, but Agni is the god of fire. So what this means is that it could be a reference to the fact that they had such long darkness, continuing nights of darkness, that they kept fires burning in order to be able to see, because there was no light, at least, I guess coming from the stars, I guess, and the moon. And then let's see here. There's also an explanation given in the Taittiriya Samhita to kind of explain what the purpose of all these chants and anxiety is. And it says, Chitravasu is the night. In the old times, the Brahmins were afraid that it would not dawn. So they're afraid that the sun's not going to come up, is basically. And then next thing is Indra, the struggle between Indra and Vitra. Have you heard of Indra before? I don't think so. Yeah?
Sorry, no, I have not heard of this.
Indra is kind of like Zeus. He's the god of rainstorms, of storms, and lightning and thunder. And according to the ancient Sanskrit tradition, the Vedic tradition, he was the chief of the gods, the ancient Vedic gods. So he's you can kind of think of him as like another type of Zeus, or Zeus by another name. So every night, according to the Vedic literature, Indra would fight with Vritra, who was a great serpent, a great snake. They called him the Great Encompasser. Anyway, I'll come to that. So Asuras are the evil gods in the Vedic and also in the Hindu tradition. And every night Indra would come to fight with them. So Indra is described as Shatakratu, which means master of 100 sacrifices. And this is one of the areas where Bal Gangadhar disagrees with most of the mainstream translations of this, because in what he said is throughout most of the Rig Veda, this refers to sacrifices, but some of the translators, they didn't accept that. They couldn't understand, so they translated it as 100 powers, even though it's supposed to mean 100 sacrifices. And according to the Rig Veda, Indra, in his regular struggles with Vritra, he destroys, and there's 3 different numbers given: 90, 99, or 100 enemy fortresses during this nightly struggle, depending on what part of the Rig Veda you're looking at. And then there's this thing called the Ratri Satras, which are night sacrifices. And those are 100 sacrifices that are offered, sacrifices of Soma. And Soma is it's like a drink that they used to make by mixing milk with some kind of plant, and nobody knows the plant that was used anymore. That knowledge has been lost. But the priest would drink some of it, and the rest he would pour out. So Vritra, his name means enveloper, and he's also called Nadavirti, which means encompasser of rivers. And so during the night, Indra would fight with Vritra, and they also talk about that. There's some Sanskrit words, apturya, which means a struggle for waters, and then goishti, the striving for cows, and divishti, the striving for day. And according to the legend, Vritra has 99 fortresses, which Indra destroys during the fight. And then when he beats Vritra, then he releases the water to flow again and the light and the cows. And the cows are symbolic of months of the year. So what he says is that this legend is all referring to the nights of darkness, and throughout the night, the long night of 11 weeks of pure darkness, these guys would keep the fires burning, and they would offer nightly sacrifices of Soma in order to help Indra with his struggle against Vritra. And then, when the dawn appears, they would start their dawn chants and their rituals. And you mentioned like the Nordic cultures. So if you look at the Viking mythology, there is something called Jormungandr, the world serpent, which encircles all of Midgard, kind of like Vritra. And they also have the world tree, which they say Midgard sits in the middle of the world tree. And in the higher levels... Huh?
Yggdrasil.
Yeah, Yggdrasil. So it may be that, like if the Vedic Aryans were living up there in the North Pole, they would be to the north of these Scandinavian people. And it would make sense for there to be some cultural similarities. So maybe Yggdrasil is kind of inspired by the Earth's axis, like Mount Meru, and then the gods live in the upper levels, that kind of thing. So then there's this other thing, my last bit of evidence, and this also is another thing that's in the book, called the Ariana Vejo, which was evidence from, it comes from the Iranian text called the Avesta, which is like an ancient Zoroastrian holy text. And what happened is when the Greeks came and they took over, like with Alexander the Great, they conquered the Persians. They found this list of 16 places where, according to their own history, the Persians had lived in the past before they came to their current homeland. And 10 out of the 16 places had equivalent, Greek names. They were known to the Greeks. And then most of them, I think all but one, have been identified with modern places in, places that have been found today, except for the first one, which was called the Ariana Vejo. And the Ariana Vejo was the original homeland that the Iranians, or the Persian Aryans, used to live, supposedly. And I've got let's see, I'm just going to read like part of that, which was included in this book. I marked my place here. I thought I marked my place here. Okay, so the Avesta actually gives a reason for why their ancestors left the Ariana Vejo. And the citation here it comes from the Vindadad, Fargard 1. Okay, so it says, the first of the good lands and countries which I, Ahura Mazda, created was the Ariana Vejo, by the good river Daitya. Thereupon came Angramanyu, who is all death, and he counteracted by his witchcraft the serpent in the river, and winter, a work of the Devas. There are 10 winter months there, 2 summer months, and those are cold for the waters, cold for the earth, cold for the trees. Winter falls there with the worst of its plagues. So, and I'm not going into like everything, but basically, the Zoroastrian belief system, they have like 2 main gods. They have Ahura Mazda, and then they have this other one called, what's the other one called? Here they call him Angramanyu. But basically, the evil god, every place where the Iranians were dwelling, he introduces like a negative thing that forces them to leave. So here they're saying he introduces, like he reverses the situation, makes a opposite to what it's supposed to be, where they would have had, 10 months of light and warm summers. Now they have like, I guess they still have 10 months of light, but it's frigid, all year around now. And that supposedly is why they left their original domain, and it may be that the Zoroastrian custom of keeping fires burning all year round, that could have been something that started when they were living up north. Okay, so that's basically like touching the surface of this. There's a lot more mythology surrounding this thing. But what I want to do is, again, like the whole issue of there's no land up there except for a few islands continues to be a problem. And there's a guy named Gerardus Mercator who lived during the 16th century, and he made this map which actually depicted Hyperborea. He made it in 1595. It was showing like the world from the top down, with the North Pole in the center of the map, and he called it the Septentrionalium Terrarum Descriptio, which shows where Hyperborea allegedly was. And the land is kind of divided up into four. It's kind of a roughly circular continent divided into four subcontinents by rivers, which are flowing out of a central lake. And there's this mountain in the middle of the lake, which is connected with the North Pole. And he compiled this based on earlier accounts of earlier explorers and also some mythology that was, I guess, in the libraries back then or in discussion, in order to kind of extrapolate where Hyperborea would be. And if you look at some of the older maps, from the 1700s, 1600s, even maybe some from the 1800s, you can kind of see something being put at the top to represent Hyperborea. Usually it's depicted as like 4 islands around a central mountain. So again, like the whole thing is, I saw all this and I was thinking, okay, well, maybe there's something underneath the sea that kind of corresponds with that, assuming that there was ever people there. And it looks like most of the Arctic, the northern polar region, is connected to the North American plate. So it's not like there's a separate continental shelf there, which might have sunk. And according to all of the maps I've seen, it looks like the ocean is deepest underneath the North Pole. And I'll include some pictures of this. So it looks like the map created by...
How deep is it? Yeah.
I don't know. I should have looked that up. I'll put something in the slideshow, but it's the deepest, like in the area where Hyperborea should have been, according to Gerardus Mercator. That's where the ocean is the deepest. However, okay. you know what I did find is that the continental plates, or the continental shelf, runs up pretty far into the north, like from Russia and also from North America. So, like if the water level was lower in the past, there would actually be a lot of land there, but the area just underneath the North Pole would still be an ocean, but it would be a much smaller ocean. It would be more like a great inland sea, kind of like the Mediterranean or something like that. So we mentioned, when you did your presentation on Doggerland, it does look like the water levels were lower in the past. I mean, those people weren't like living underneath the water when they...
It was substantial. It was like 120 meters, which
yeah.
I don't know how much that is in feet, but...
So what that means is, if the water level was lower there, it's going to be lower all over the world. So there would have been a lot more land to the north.
Yeah.
And there would also be a land bridge between Alaska and Kamchatka that you could easily walk across.
It's about 400 feet lower. Yeah.
So I
think the ocean is deeper on the North Pole. But then again, like, I don't know.
It is.
Yeah.
It is underneath the North Pole, but it like if you lower that water, then the land goes much further north, both from Russia and from America, and the Arctic Ocean would be much smaller during if the water, So so it looks like that maybe the map is wrong, but it could be that there was a lot more land there in the past. I mean, there must have been, because you used to be able, it was low enough for dogger land to be above the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And the Native Americans, they probably really did walk across the land bridge, at least for North America, you know, because that would have been revealed too. So this is where we get in.
Would have been frozen probably, but
would it?
It would have been frozen.
Maybe, or maybe the climate was different back then. You know, like also one thing I found is that there's other evidence of the water having been lower. Like there's all kinds of cities that are underneath the water along the west coast of India that, you know, in their own mythology, the water level rose and these cities got buried. Of course, that would have been after this Vedic stuff. That was a later time. But then there's also cities like that in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, where people had to move and relocate, and then they built another city by the coast, and then it rose, and then they had to move again. So the question is, you know,
it's almost like this climate change has been around for longer.
Yeah, it sounds, yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that Bal Gangadhar mentioned in his book is that there have been expeditions to the Arctic where they've taken core samples from beneath the ocean floor, and they found like terrestrial plants, you know, kind of like from a temperate climate being there, buried in this, you know, underneath the sea. So now there's a couple. I mean, it's indisputable that the land was lower in the past. Sorry, the water was lower in the past, but whether it was because the water, you know, it could be that the water was all in the form of ice, like the ice age was going on, or it could be that
lakes. There were also some lakes in northern North America, I believe, that ended up flooding into the ocean, which they contributed to the demise of darker land, for example. So
that's right. Another possibility might be that there was just less water in the world back then, because in fact there's a lot of water in space, and there's even water on the moon that was deposited there by ice meteors. And they found stuff up north, like animals frozen upright, including woolly mammoths, because they were buried in ice rapidly. And it kind of, you know, if this thing from the Avesta is true about it used to be a good land and then it was frozen and the ice is hard on the trees and the animals and everything, maybe there was some kind of snap freeze that forced people to move south. Because if you could live in the north, in the Arctic region, then there would be a very great advantage to it. Like they talk about,
like what you talked about, the harvest. If you could grow your crops for 10 months a year or something
with unending daylight, it would be 6 months, because the dawn wouldn't be enough. But like there's actually
very, very rich harvest for 6 months, I guess, right?
Oh yeah, and
it's
actually
it's like having a greenhouse, but you don't have to pay for electricity.
Yeah, and there's actually a place in Alaska called the Matanasuka Susitna Valley, and I'll put pictures of this. But they grow 138-pound cabbages, 65-pound cantaloupes, and 35-pound broccoli, and among other things. Like they grow pumpkins that are big enough that you could fit inside of it after all the seeds are scooped out. And so 138-pound cabbage, just for reference, when I was in high school, I weighed 135 pounds when I was a senior in high school. That's a big cabbage. And they're able to do it because like that place, they only have a growing season that lasts 105 days, but it gets 19 hours of sunlight. So it's not even as far north as these people would have been. But just with that amount of light and in that short time, they grow some monster-sized produce. So it would make sense, you know. Um, now, and I don't know, like, I'm not 100% convinced about all this, but I think it's definitely in the realm of possible, moving towards probable. And I say that one of the reasons I say that is, like in the Bible, it also mentions that people used to live longer, like close to 1,000 years. And then after the flood, each generation lived shorter and shorter and shorter. So it could be that there was, if if the water levels were lower and the climate was still kind of good, still in the process of changing, there would have probably been some people living further north of the Scythians. And of course, there'd be obvious advantages to that. But then as the ice came, they would have to leave. So that's pretty much everything I've got on this. I know there's like a lot more to it, but I may do like I'm still looking for archaeological evidence. And if there's archaeological evidence that can be found, it'd be like, okay, sure. Like now I kind of see this as a reasonable theory with some evidence, like the Vedic chants, things like how long it would take them to do this dawn chant. Like there's not enough time for that in most of the world where we live today. And also the thing about Indra, like him being so important in the Vedic culture, he's not that important today in Hinduism. And actually, like in the Ramayana, they have a story about Indra that's kind of disgusting, where Indra is after some woman, and so he gets punished by sprouting lady parts all over his body. And then later on, yeah, and then later on, like one of the other gods or somebody turns them into eyes. So instead of being covered with that, he's covered with eyes. But he said, "Oh, because you're so interested in women, here, have some part." And it kind of reminded me, like, I was thinking, if in the past, Indra was so important, and they would pray and offer like hundreds of sacrifices and everything because he's struggling to end the darkness. But then you move to India, which is a monsoon climate, and there's not really a significant difference in the length of day around the world because it's a tropical and subtropical place. So Indra wouldn't have been as important after they moved there, and he gets kind of brushed aside. Same for Ushas. And when it comes to the slideshow, and the images that I'm using, I didn't find, I'm probably going to use the Greek and Roman images of like Eos, which is supposedly the same deity, or at least functionally is, because I couldn't find anything really for Ushas. Not really important today as far as modern Hindus go, and neither was Indra for that matter. But they were like very important in the Vedas. So it definitely, seems like there was a location shift. And at any rate, the Vedic Aryans, they didn't start out in India. They came down from further north. We know that for a fact. But how far north? That is, and that's kind of what this Arctic home in the Vedas was getting about. So.
Yeah, cool story, dude. Appreciate it.
Yeah, hopefully people will find it useful. I think there was something else. Oh yes, the artwork. So it turns out there's when I started doing this topic, I'm like, where am I going to find all the images of this stuff from? This is, and there's actually a Russian artist. His name is Vsevolod Ivanov, and he illustrated just about everything, like that I'm talking about, like the all this stuff that he must have read Bal Gangadhar Tilak's book. But also there's, this stuff is in Slavic traditions too. And some of the Slavic cultures, they have these two gods called Belobog and Chernobog, which means like the god of light and the god of darkness, kind of like Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, the Zoroastrian tradition. And it's like getting to the genetic side of things. All the Slavic cultures, the Vedic culture, probably also the Scythians, although I'm not sure like if any of the Scythians survived genetically, but the Iranians for sure. All those groups are R1a haplogroup. So if there was people living up further north, then these Hyperboreans, they most likely also would have been part of the R1a group, and then they would have been adjacent to the Germanic cultures. The early Germanic cultures, they all started in like Denmark and Scandinavia mostly. And of course, today you have another people group living in the north of Scandinavia called the Sami. And the Sami are not part of the Indo-European group, but probably they came in there across the the Arctic, the northern latitudes going around. So it may be that as the climate was changing, these people could have wandered in from kind of the east and the north. But in the past, like the Vedic culture and also the Iranians, the Iranian Aryans, they were all living up there in that area. And Germanic people were like right next to them, which could be why they have some of the similar kind of legends, like Jormungandr being similar to Vritra, the great encompasser, and then the world tree, that kind of stuff. And also, it's interesting, like the Hindu cosmology, which I've been trying to find out more about, talks about other worlds, and some are above the earth and some are beneath. Kind of like how the Vikings with their world tree, they have some other, the Midgard is in the center, and they have some that are above and some that are beneath. So obviously there's a lot of stuff to study and to learn more. I'm actually more familiar with the Viking worlds than I am with the Hindu worlds. I know that like the Hindu worlds, they have some more monstrous creatures coming from the lower worlds. Like they have these things called nagas that are humanoid. They have humanoid upper bodies and lower bodies like a snake. And of course, the lowest world in the Viking mythology is Hell, not like Hel1L, where Loki's daughter lives and presides over the dishonored dead, Hela. And then there's some other worlds down there. I think Svartalfheim is one of the lower worlds, and what's the other? It's a Muspelheim. It's Muspelheim, right?
You have Niflheim and Muspelheim.
Okay, yeah.
The one, Niflheim is frozen.
Yes.
Muspelheim is the fiery one. I'm not mistaken.
It might be good to do a topic about comparative mythology of these different worlds, these different systems. Anyways, that's all I got, unless you want to add anything.
No, interesting story. Appreciate it.
All right.
Yeah.
Well then,
I would say like, share, subscribe.
Yeah.
And let us know if you think this is a good, you believe in it, or if you have a different theory. Please put it in the comments. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks, Ivor.
Sure. Great.